The PET was before my time, just. The first Commodore I saw was a friend's VIC-20 and he was playing Attack of the Mutant Camels, a game that was like Centipede on steroids. But I was firmly in the Sinclair camp. Nothing by Commodore could sway me. Like Liverpool versus Everton, you had to back your team, even if your team had inferior graphics, sound, keyboard, memory. I could go on, but it would make me sad. The PET was one of 3 personal computers that appeared in 1977. For Commodore, it was something that had to succeed as their existing business was dying. The gamble paid off in spectacular fashion, and they went on to dominate the 1980s with some excellent computers. That foundation was built with the PET, their first fully integrated home computer, and a machine that went on to have a much longer life than you might realise. But not this long. I mean, what is this? Welcome to the Commodore PET story. Commodore was founded in the 1950s to sell and manufacture typewriters, the must-have device in the office to produce professional letters. In the 1960s, they dabbled with adding machines, then the first electronic calculators. Commodore was one of the first companies to see that electronic calculators were going to become very popular and got in early rebranding models from companies like Casio. Sales grew steadily, but the low end was eaten away by Japanese companies that soon refused to license their products. That left Commodore with high-end machines, but then that avenue was cut off in 1975. Texas Instruments supplied many of the key components that made up a calculator, and under pressure from cheaper Japanese integrated designs, decided to take control of the market. They launched a range of calculators that retailed for less than the cost of the parts they sold to Commodore, making it impossible for Commodore to make a profit. At the same time, there were rapid developments in microprocessors. New designs such as Intel's 8080 and the Motorola 6800 were allowing hobbyists to put together a real computer for a somewhat affordable price. Computers had gone from 1960s mainframes through early 1970s mini computers and were now getting small enough to put in a box on your desk. Those boxes could do useful things, something that Motorola's customers noticed. They were balking at the price of the 6800 and lobbying for something simpler and less expensive. A group at Motorola decided to do just that, but the company didn't see the value and shut the project down. Chuck Peddle was one of the 6800's designers and one of the people working on this simplified version. He could see this type of chip was the future. It was what customers were asking for after all, and so he left the company to pursue his dream. Chuck looked to another company to produce a chip and landed at MOS Technology, along with half the team that had worked on the 6800. Chips like the Intel 8080 and the Motorola 6800 were really mini-computer chips that sold for around $175. The MOS team set themselves a goal of creating a chip that could retail for just $5. That sounds ridiculously low, but there was method to their madness. Several chips are produced on one large wafer, but at that time a good percentage of them had imperfections that meant that they didn't work. If you make a smaller, simpler chip, you could not only fit more chips on the wafer, but there was a higher percentage chance that each of them would work. This new chip might not be as good as the Motorola 6800, but with supporting chips that brought the price up to around $20. That would allow it to give the Motorola 6800 a good run for its money at a fraction of the cost. With a big fanfare in late 1975, MOS launched 2 chips, the 6501 and the 6502. The 6501 was pin compatible with the Motorola 6800, but didn't have many of its features. The 6502 wasn't pin compatible, but included an on-chip clock oscillator, so removing the need to have this circuitry. It was a little more costly, but when producing a new microcomputer design, it was a smart choice. All that publicity got the attention of Motorola, who disagreed with Chuck Peddle that their new chips didn't infringe on Motorola's patents. It didn't help that one of the team that had jumped ship to MOS had brought Motorola's trade secrets with him. There was a big court battle and MOS lost. They had to pay a large fine and stop selling the 6501. Commodore were having business problems as well. Being unable to produce profitable calculators, they bought several chip suppliers, including MOS Technology, to make sure that they could get a steady supply of chips once they designed their own calculator. Chuck Peddle had come with a MOS Technology purchase. He convinced Commodore's head Jack Tramiel that calculators were not the future. Every man and his dog were producing calculators, and with the price dropping, there was no money to be made. Instead, they should look at personal computers. That might not have been much of a hard sell. MOS had the 6502, a chip tailor-made for personal computers. It was being demonstrated through a reference microcomputer design, the MDT650, and Chuck Peddle had designed the KIM-1. Its small keyboard and display showed it could be turned into an advanced calculator, but it could also be connected to a monitor and a cassette drive to turn it into something more like a home micro. In fact, MOS were making a tiny profit selling KIM-1s, such was the buzz around the 6502. This began a relationship between Commodore and computer buyers. Commodore learnt what customers wanted, and customers got familiar with the 6502. The idea of Commodore making a personal computer gained traction when Tandy came to talk with them and shared that their hobbyist customers didn't want a kit computer to solder up, they wanted a fully built turnkey machine. Chuck Peddle was seeing the same thing, so it was decided Commodore would sell an integrated personal computer that was simple to use. Just turn it on and start coding. At the start, it wasn't clear that Commodore would design it though. Two people called Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had used the 6502 to produce the Apple I. Commodore met with the Steves with the idea of buying the company and using the Apple design as the basis for their new machine, but in the end it didn't work out. Commodore balked at Steve Jobs' high valuation. Commodore built a team of young people to work on their new computer. Armed with just enough knowledge to be dangerous, they learnt along the way. This was an advantage. They didn't have set ideas in the industry, so broke the rules. But by doing this, they found better and cheaper ways to accomplish what was already in the market. Like Tandy and Apple, Commodore saw that the obvious programming language was BASIC. College kids had learnt it over the past 10 years and were using it in business. What's more, there was already a good BASIC interpreter from Microsoft, and they were willing to port it to the 6502 and license it to Commodore for a one-off payment. Apparently the deal would nearly bankrupt Microsoft, as the payment would only come through once Commodore's computer finally shipped, and it was delayed several times. Other machines loaded the BASIC interpreter from cassette or disk, essentially like booting into Windows or Linux today. But Commodore realized this needed to be a simple computer for programmers. By putting the BASIC in ROM, the computer would be ready to go as soon as it was powered on. That ROM would also contain an intuitive screen editor written by Chuck Peddle himself. Another key feature Commodore wanted was a parallel port to daisy-chain disk drives or printers. Even if the computer bombed in the home programmer market, it could still be sold to those who wanted something to control devices through an IEEE standard parallel interface. By adding this feature, they were giving the computer more chance of success. Another thing that might help was a name. A big fad at the time was the Pet Rock. This was a stone in a box that you bought and was supposed to look after. Yeah, I know it sounds stupid now, but for 5 minutes it was a phenomenon. During that time, the team were working on Commodore's computer, and they joked around that they were working on a pet computer. It was supposed to be a warm and friendly machine that was easy to use, so the Pet name stuck. Of course, Pet had to stand for something, so it was reverse engineered to become the Personal Electronic Transactor. Commodore announced the PET early, the summer of 1976, but at this stage the system was just a few ideas that needed to come together. But by CES in January 1977, a barely working computer was shown off. Tandy was one of those that got to see it, and Jack Tramiel laid out a deal. We'll let you sell this home computer at Radio Shack, but you have to take our line of calculators as well. Given Tandy were about to give the go-ahead to produce their own computer, the TRS-80, it's understandable that they passed. In 1977, before any popular home computer had launched, it wasn't clear what type of keyboard would be best. Calculators had all those extra symbols for things like multiplication, memory, exponents, and percentages. Would computers need keys for special operations? What would they be? Surely a next-generation device required a next-generation keyboard. Given this background, the Commodore PET's keyboard was a little different, using small calculator-style keys lined up in neat rows and columns, with a whole row above the letters reserved for special characters and a small key for the space instead of a full spacebar. The shift keys allowed the user to draw all kinds of shapes with special characters. Commodore didn't have a lot of money to make the case, but what they did have was a factory in Canada that made filing cabinets. What do you get when a filing cabinet maker is told to go ahead and make a computer case? You get this. The PET might have been shown off at CES in January 1977, but it took until October that year before any were shipped to software developers, and it took until December for customer deliveries to begin. It launched as the PET 2001 series, maybe a nod to the futuristic film 2001: A Space Odyssey. What they received was a computer, screen, and cassette recorder or data set. Programs were saved at 1500 baud, and the data was stored twice to increase the chance it could be read back. Unlike the TRS-80, there was a lot of expansion ports that allowed for extra memory, a second cassette recorder, a parallel port, and that IEEE standard parallel interface. If you needed to service your PET, the whole front lifted up and held in place with a handy stand, like the bonnet of your car. PET went up against the more expensive Apple II and Tandy's TRS-80. The TRS-80 might be the cheapest home computer at just $599 with a monitor and cassette recorder, but the PET would beat it at only $495. At least that was the initial plan. Once Commodore saw the demand for their computer and the ever-growing waiting list, as they slowly ramped up production, the price soon increased. They also ditched the entry-level 4K model. The official line was that the 4K machine would have been next to useless, but the $795 8K model plus larger 16K and 32K models brought in much more revenue. In a way, Commodore wasn't surprised at this demand. Upon the PET's launch, Chuck Peddle was talking about stratospheric demand for such a machine, $50 million of sales in 1978. He felt, in the long run, everyone in the US would be a programmer. Programming would become as essential as reading. The PET was better than the TRS-80 in that it could display both upper and lowercase letters. Like the TRS-80, it didn't have high-resolution graphics, but it had those special characters that could be used to create diagrams, crude pictures, and of course games. It also had no sound, although like the TRS-80, simple sounds could be heard by connecting some pins on the expansion port to an amplifier. The early computer scene was rife with software piracy. Many people simply copied the code rather than purchasing it. Given this, Commodore was worried about people pirating their version of BASIC, which had been modified and improved to work with the PET hardware. To that end, early machines couldn't peek or access memory above 49,152 to view the copyrighted code. This wasn't such an odd thing to do. The built-in software was better than the stock TRS-80 or even an Apple II, with floating point support, lowercase letters, and a good screen editor. Indeed, the whole machine was a cut above the TRS-80. Demand for the PET exploded and Commodore had trouble keeping up with demand. But in 1978, they began expanding into foreign markets such as Europe and Japan, producing a Japanese version with katakana characters. One of the major issues with the PET was its funky keyboard with its odd layout that was very small and hard to type on. Oh, and the lettering tended to easily rub off. It was nicknamed the chiclet keyboard as it resembled the popular gum. Swapping it for something usable was an easy fix, and in 1979 Commodore launched the updated 2001N model with a much friendlier keyboard layout and size. The regular chiclet PET stayed on sale for the same price as the new model, so you had a choice: worse keyboard and a cassette drive, or get a better keyboard and pay another $95 for a $30 cassette recorder with a special cable. The keyboard was still a little strange to modern eyes, though, with a top row of keys reserved for punctuation. Microsoft worked with Commodore to create BASIC 2.0. It was more practical by allowing arrays to hold more than 256 elements, as well as many other changes and bug fixes. It also included an Easter egg coded by Bill Gates himself. If you typed in poke 6502, X, it would display Microsoft X times on the display. When Commodore found out, they weren't amused. They could have used that ROM space to add more features, but it was done by Microsoft to show that they were the company behind Commodore BASIC. Well, better late than never, Commodore's brand new external dual floppy disk arrived, much later than the TRS-80 and the Apple II drives. Commodore were keen to launch peripherals as they saw that there was a lot of money to be made out of owners who wished to expand their computer with printers, disk drives and extra memory. Commodore were going as fast as they could, but it just wasn't as fast as their competitors. The PET 2001 N series with its typer-friendly keyboard removed the major sticking point and sales continued to blossom, although it was nowhere near as popular as the TRS-80. With Dutch company Philips owning the trademark on the PET name, the computer was rebranded in Europe as the CBM 3000 series. A year later, in 1980, the PET was updated with BASIC 4.0 that introduced more disk commands. A new 80-column PET sold as the 8000 series, so the 40-column 2001N was rebranded as the 4000 series. The screen got larger and a lot greener. The case was now made of structural foam, and instead of bodging sound output to an amplifier, there was a tiny speaker built in to offer basic audio. The Commodore badge hid two openings that were just the right size for two floppy drives. Clearly this was something that Commodore were looking to implement, but the PET never got integrated floppy drives. With an extra 16K costing a whopping $300, many PET users were just buying the 16K model and installing their own RAM upgrade. Commodore put a stop to that by punching holes in the expansion memory positions on the 8K and 16K models. The 8000 series was aimed at expanding into the business market. 80 columns made it easier to read a great deal of text or numbers for business applications, like the new VisiCalc spreadsheet program that appeared the same year the 8000 series launched. Where regular PETs could only work with 32K of RAM, the 8000 could be expanded to 96K using bank switching. Business versions had more usable keyboards with the number keys in the usual location. But with the CP/M operating system popular for business applications, the PET was held back because it was thought it couldn't work with the 6502 processor. It would take until 1989, well after the PET ended production, until someone proved them wrong. Until then, CP/M was mainly held back because it came on such large floppy disks. The new PET range was clearly aimed at the business and the education market. The consumer market was well served with Commodore's newest machine, the VIC-20, that sold for less than half the price of the entry-level PET. PET disk drives weren't cheap, they cost more than the computer itself, but they became an important part of kit in places like schools where one 4040 dual drive could be shared across multiple computers. It was a sturdy unit that could stand up to the onslaught of a bunch of school kids. As Commodore didn't have a core competency in printers, they rebranded from companies such as Epson. Eventually a range of hard drives were also available. Commodore expanded their range with a modem and a voice synthesizer. The voice box was produced by the same company that produced the Vox box for the TRS-80, but neither model sold in great numbers. In 1981, Commodore introduced the Super PET.
This is a story about an ordinary
computer.
When he was made, they found something wrong with him and threw him away like a piece of rubbish into an old dark storeroom. Then, from outer space, a spotty man brought him to life with his cosmic dust. He took him to a magic cloud where Mother Nature gave him special powers. That
Computer
became
Super PET.
Designed at the University of Waterloo, the Super PET was meant to teach programming. Along with a regular 6502 motherboard, there was a second 6809 board and users could switch between them. It offered a range of programming languages including APL, COBOL, Fortran and Pascal. By now, Commodore was one of the largest computer companies in the world. The VIC-20 was proving to be very popular in the home market, but the PET wasn't selling so well. It didn't have high-resolution graphics, which would be handy for business charts. It was monochrome and it was limited to only addressing the first 32K of memory. It was retired in 1982. Commodore expected to replace it with the CBM2 line of computers, but they were a failure, and Commodore focused instead on their new runaway success, the Commodore 64. To try to take back some of the education market lost to the Apple IIe, Commodore attempted to sell the 64 into the education market. It needed to be rugged though, so they put a C64 into a PET case and called it the Educator 64. With the failure of Commodore's CBM2 line, the PET got a reprieve in 1984 as the 80XX series in Europe, where demand was still relatively strong. There was a new motherboard, but the big change was on the outside with a new shape and detachable keyboard. It used updated disk drives in the same case used for the Commodore 64's 1541 drive. This new PET lasted until 1986, by which time Commodore had launched the Amiga, a machine designed as their new business powerhouse. It's surprising then that at the same time Commodore was selling the advanced Amiga, they were still selling the positively ancient PET. Commodore declared bankruptcy in 1994. The owner of the brand thought it was a good idea to launch an Android smartphone in 2015 with Commodore PET branding. Those in the market for a middling Android phone weren't looking for Commodore PET nostalgia, and the phone sank without a trace. Chuck Peddle had a lot to be proud of. He saw the world needed a cut-price chip to power personal computers and helped to make it happen. He pushed to create a microcomputer that would use that chip, and his innovative BASIC editor was still in use when the Commodore 128 launched in 1985. Chuck's PET project was rightly a wild hit when it launched in 1977, the right computer for the right price. The TRS-80 had the distribution mechanism and sold more, but the PET was better quality and delivered more features for the price. It was built on Commodore's own chip that powered many other successful personal computers, including the Apple II, Acorn's Micros, as well as the Atari Nintendo line of wildly popular games machines. But the PET's lack of sound and in particular high-resolution graphics held it back. CBM stood for Commodore Business Machines, and despite the fact that Commodore had been selling into businesses since the 50s, their computers weren't found in offices, but rather bedrooms of kids across the world. But the PET is rightly seen as an excellent machine that gave many their first introduction to computing. There's a video about the history of BASIC and the Tandy TRS-80 on the right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.